Okay, so now I'm going to introduce the topic of authenticated encryption very briefly. So a lot of the security problems in cryptography come from the fact that there are two worlds. So there's the developer world with people just wanting to write awesome code, wanting to write also secure code, but sometimes don't really know about cryptography because why would they? They're programmers. They don't need to know about all this math stuff. And there are mathematicians or researcher, computer scientists at universities that formulate these complicated cryptographic primitives, and then breaches happen and the researchers say, oh, the programmer used our good primitives wrong, you're not supposed to use AES CBC in this context. And the programmers say, hey, you researchers, what are you doing for a living? I wanted to use your primitive, but it just totally blew up and my app got insecure. And encryption is one of these things, like, as I've mentioned earlier, Apache mod session used CBC encryption, and they thought that was secure because the session data is encrypted. Well, that's what the developers thought. The researchers thought, hey, that's encryption. We never claimed that our encryption primitives are secure against attackers that can modify the ciphertext. They're just meant as a way to encrypt data. Well, since we want to use encrypted data, but also in a way that can't be altered by an attacker, authenticated encryption was introduced. So, authenticated encryption essentially combines MACs, message authentication functions, with encryption. So, encryption you can imagine as something like AES, CBC, and method authentication codes can imagine as something like an HMAC, for example. So what authenticated encryption does is it combines the ciphertext with a tag that such that the recipient knows the ciphertext wasn't altered with. So, for example, all of these bit flipping attacks don't work. Well, but there are different ways we could use authenticated encryption. For example, we could do a MAC then encrypt scheme. We could take the plain text, do a MAC on the plain text, then we have plain text and MAC. This can't be altered. Then we encrypt that with AES, for example, and then we have the ciphertext. This was, for example, used in TLS up until TLS 1.2, so the recent one. Why is that a bad idea? Well, it doesn't offer ciphertext integrity, meaning that we can still flip bits in the ciphertext that wouldn't be noticed. Just when the server, for example, decrypts the ciphertext, then it would notice that the MAC is wrong. Why is that a problem? Well, for example, the CBC padding oracle would still work. It would still be able to decrypt all ciphertexts with it. Encrypt then MAC. Well, that is used across some systems with some tweaks. Engineers like it. People that coming from theory don't like it because security proofs are a bit bogus in that aspect. So this one you also shouldn't use. What you should use is an encrypt then MAC scheme that is depicted here. So you take the plain text, you encrypt it with key 1, then you take the encryption and put a MAC on the encryption itself, and then you have ciphertext and a MAC. So now if the recipient receives this message, he checks actually if the ciphertext was modified with this MAC, and if it was modified, it just gets discarded. So for example, a CBC padding oracle just doesn't work in this context. So this should always be the go-to option that you use.